A man stands bound in the dry dust of an ancient Judean courtyard. The afternoon sun is blinding, and a crowd has formed a loose circle around him. You are sitting in a quiet church sanctuary, or perhaps holding hands in a living room with a few close friends. The atmosphere is peaceful. The religious leaders of the first century attempt to use this exact courtroom procedure to trap Jesus and execute a vulnerable woman. They drag her into the open dust, cite the law of Moses, and demand the stones be thrown. They believe they have built a perfect legal snare, but they overlook a fatal flaw in their own case. It is early morning in the temple courts. The air is cool, but the atmosphere is volatile. A group of scribes and Pharisees drag a woman through the crowd and force her into the center of the courtyard. She is humiliated, terrified, and bracing for violence. Her accusers are holding stones. They announce that she was caught in the very act of adultery. Then they turn to Jesus and ask for his verdict. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? They do not actually care about the woman's morality. They are using her as bait. If Jesus dismisses the law of Moses, he loses his authority as a prophet. If he orders the execution, he violates Roman law, which forbids Jewish leaders from carrying out the death penalty. It seems like a flawless trap, but the religious leaders have made a fatal miscalculation. They have forgotten that Jesus is the architect of the very law they are trying to manipulate. Jesus does not panic. The lights are dim. Someone begins to pray, and they quote one of the most famous, comforting verses in the entire New Testament. He bends down and writes in the dust with his finger. The silence stretches. The accusers continue to demand an answer. Finally, he stands up and speaks one of the most famous sentences in history. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. For centuries, we have read this as a general moral proverb. We assume Jesus is simply saying, nobody is perfect, so nobody should judge. But in the ancient Jewish courtroom, this was not a gentle lesson on hypocrisy. It was a brilliant, lethal legal counterstrike. Jesus is directly invoking Deuteronomy 17. He is reminding them of the executioner's rule. The hand of the witnesses shall be first against him, to put him to death. By telling them to throw the first stone, Jesus is officially calling the court to order. He is demanding that the two required witnesses step out of the crowd, identify themselves publicly, and initiate the execution. But he adds a terrifying qualification. The witness must be without sin. In this context, he is not demanding absolute moral perfection. He is demanding legal integrity. He is reminding them of the trap of perjury. If they set this woman up, if they orchestrated the crime, or if they are hiding their own guilt in the same matter, they are false witnesses, Ed Sheikar. And if they throw that first stone as false witnesses, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. We read those words in Matthew 18. The law of retaliation will immediately demand their own execution. Jesus holds up the mirror of the law, and the reflection is terrifying. He bends down and writes in the dust a second time. The silence returns. Then, a heavy sound echoes across the temple courtyard. A stone hits the pavement. Then another, beginning with the oldest men. The accusers turn and walk away. The snare has been broken. The witnesses have vanished. When Jesus stands back up, the courtroom is empty. Only the woman remains, because there are no witnesses left to initiate the execution. Jesus dismisses the case legally and extends absolute grace. Neither do I condemn you, go. And from now on, sin no more. The stones of accusation are left behind in the dust. The law of Moses worked exactly as it was designed. It exposed the malicious accusers and protected the vulnerable. That would already be significant. But the story does not end there. Months later, Jesus takes this very same law, lifts it out of the ancient courtroom, and changes its purpose entirely. The stones of accusation were left behind in the dust. The law of Moses had done its job by exposing the malicious intent of the religious leaders. But shortly after that encounter, Jesus sits down with his disciples and completely redesigns the architecture of the ancient courtroom. And assume Jesus is giving us a warm, sentimental promise about small prayer meetings. We assume he is offering consolation for low attendance. He is explaining how his new followers must handle conflict and sin within their community. He gives a clear progression. First, if a brother sins against you, you must go to him in private. You do not gossip. You do not gather a mob. You seek a quiet resolution. But what if the person refuses to listen? Jesus gives the next step in Matthew 18:16. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. For the modern reader, this sounds like standard administrative procedure. For the Jewish disciples sitting around Jesus, the phrase was electric. They knew the book of Deuteronomy by heart. When Jesus said, by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, they instantly saw the city gate. They remembered the executioner's rule. They felt the rough weight of the rock. Jesus is deliberately using the severe, lethal vocabulary of the capital trial. But then, he abruptly flips the objective. In the ancient law, the witnesses gathered to ensure the guilty person was put to death. In the community of Jesus, the witnesses gather to ensure the guilty person is pulled back from the edge of spiritual ruin, assuring us that even if only a few people show up, God is still listening. But that is not what Jesus is doing. Notice the goal Jesus states just 1 verse earlier. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. This is the great architectural shift of the New Testament. Jesus takes the machinery of death and turns it into an engine of grace. The 2 or 3 witnesses are no longer executioners. They are rescuers. They are not gathering to throw stones. They are gathering to throw a lifeline. Their presence is still required to establish the truth, prevent false accusations, and bring sober reality to the situation. But the ultimate destination of this new courtroom is not punishment alone. It is restoration. Up to this point, the law of witnesses was a mechanism for physical survival. Now, it has escalated into a mechanism for spiritual rescue. And it is only within this intense, emotionally exhausting context that Jesus speaks his most famous promise. 4 verses later, he says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." When we remove this verse from its context, we reduce it to a sentimental guarantee for sparsely attended prayer meetings. But read within the fierce reality of church discipline. The promise is far more profound. Stepping into the room to confront a sinning brother is terrifying. It requires profound courage, total honesty, and a willingness to endure another person's anger. It is the heaviest burden of Christian love. The problem is not that the verse is unclear. The problem is that we stop reading too early, and we read without history. Jesus is promising that when believers enter that specific, difficult room, when they gather as the 2 or 3 witnesses to speak the truth in love, they do not stand alone. The supreme judge of the universe steps into the circle with them. He is present in the courtroom of grace. The executioner's law has been utterly transformed. But how did the early church actually practice this? As the disciples leave Jerusalem and plant churches across the hostile Roman Empire, this ancient law will be tested. It will become the primary shield for a new, incredibly vulnerable community. As the Christian movement spreads rapidly outward from Jerusalem, it steps into a highly dangerous environment. The early church had no political power, no public buildings, and no centralized legal authority. Believers gathered quietly in the crowded living rooms of the Roman Empire, often surrounded by the smell of lamp oil and the pressing heat of persecution. In these intimate, high-pressure environments, a community could easily be fractured by suspicion, envy, or false teaching. In a world without institutional protection, a whispered rumor could destroy a congregation overnight. Gossip was a lethal weapon. How does an apostle protect a fragile community from tearing itself apart? The Apostle Paul reaches back to the desert of Sinai and the words of Jesus, anchoring the churches with the ancient law of the courtroom. Writing to a young pastor named Timothy, who is leading a complex and divided congregation in Ephesus. When Jesus speaks the exact phrase, 2 or 3, his original Jewish audience did not hear a comforting cliché about evening prayer. Paul issues a strict command in 1 Timothy 5:19. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. The command is deeply practical, but it is often misunderstood. Paul is not creating a loophole for corrupt leaders to escape accountability. He is not telling the church to ignore abuse. Instead, he is building a firewall against frivolous, isolated attacks. A disgruntled church member cannot quietly destroy a pastor's reputation based on a private grievance, a personal offense, or an unverified assumption. If a leader has genuinely sinned, the community must absolutely address it. But the accusation must carry the weight of multiple voices. The accuser must find others who have seen the same behavior, willing to step into the light and stand together. Paul applies the exact same rule to the church in Corinth, facing a deeply rebellious congregation that has tolerated severe moral compromise. Paul warns them in 2 Corinthians 13:1 that he is coming to hold a formal disciplinary trial. He does not rely merely on his apostolic authority to force a conviction. He quotes the ancient law verbatim. Every charge must be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Notice what the pattern is doing. In both letters, Paul is insisting that truth requires community. Spiritual justice cannot happen in isolation. They heard the chilling vocabulary of the executioner's courtroom. Jesus is deliberately quoting the book of Deuteronomy. He is invoking the strict, ancient legal requirement for capital punishment. You cannot lob a solitary accusation into the dark and expect the church to act. Whether the church is protecting a faithful leader from a malicious rumor, or whether the congregation is finally confronting an abusive leader with the truth, the mechanism remains the same. It demands the courageous presence of others. It requires believers to look each other in the eye, align their testimony, and bear the heavy responsibility of truth-telling together. The law that once forced men to hold executioners' stones now forces believers to hold each other accountable. It is a shield that prevents the church from becoming either a dictatorship ruled by a toxic leader or a mob ruled by the loudest complainer. The ancient rule of 2 or 3 witnesses has now traveled from the dusty gates of ancient Israel to the temple courtyard in Jerusalem, and out to the house churches of the Roman world. It has successfully transformed from a mandate of physical execution into a mechanism of spiritual protection. But the biblical pattern is not quite finished. The law makes one final, staggering appearance. At the very end of the Bible, the scale expands beyond a single village, beyond a single church, and encompasses the entire earth. The world itself is placed on trial, and to deliver the final verdict, God sends exactly 2 witnesses, and this creates a jarring contradiction. Why would Jesus take a legal rule designed to establish guilt and end a human life? The scale of the courtroom expands one final time. It is no longer a dusty village gate in ancient Israel. It is no longer a quiet house church in Ephesus or Corinth. It is the entire earth. In the book of Revelation, the Apostle John sees a staggering vision of the end of the age. A hostile, corrupt world has rejected God completely. The nations are raging. Truth has been abandoned, and the global culture has become a weapon against the vulnerable. How does God respond to this massive, collective rebellion? He does not immediately shatter the sky or send a silent plague. He follows his own ancient law. He sends exactly 2 witnesses. Revelation 11 describes 2 prophets, clothed in the rough sackcloth of mourning, standing before the Lord of the earth. They are given immense spiritual authority to prophesy, to shut the sky from raining, and to strike the earth with plagues. But their primary identity is found right there in their title. They are witnesses. They are the ultimate, cosmic embodiment of the Deuteronomy law. They stand in the global courtyard, bearing united, unflinching testimony to the truth of God before a world that refuses to listen, and use it as his defining blueprint for Christian community. Why take the language of the executioner's stone and use it to promise his own divine presence? The world responds exactly as the ancient mob did. They hate the testimony, so they demand an execution. Revelation tells us that when the two witnesses have finished their testimony, a beast rises from the bottomless pit, makes war on them, and kills them. For 3.5 days, their bodies are left exposed in the streets of the great city. The world actually throws a celebration. The text says the nations rejoice over them, make merry, and even exchange gifts. Why? Because the voices that exposed their corruption and tormented their conscience have finally been silenced. The global crowd believes they have successfully cast the final stones. They think the trial is over, but they have forgotten who presides over this courtroom. The testimony of God cannot be executed. Revelation says that after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God enters the two witnesses. They stand up on their feet, and a terrifying dread falls on every person watching. A loud voice from heaven calls out, "Come up here!" And they ascend to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watch in shock. What does this surreal, apocalyptic vision mean? Scholars have debated for centuries whether these are two literal, historical prophets who will appear at the very end of time. In their hands, they hold jagged, heavy stones. The tension in the air is suffocating, but the execution cannot begin. The crowd must wait. The answer reveals one of the most profound architectural shifts in biblical history. The ancient law of 2 or 3 witnesses was never just a cold legal technicality, or a profound theological symbol representing the faithful church testifying in partnership with the Holy Spirit. But regardless of the precise prophetic timeline, the biblical pattern is unmistakable. The truth cannot be stoned to death. The law of 2 witnesses guarantees that God will never leave the world without a clear, legally binding testimony of His truth. And even when a hostile empire attempts to execute the messengers and silence the accusation, the testimony of God will always resurrect. The divine law of evidence remains unbroken. The witnesses are ultimately vindicated, and the cosmic trial is settled. But what does this magnificent vision mean for you? Standing in your own quiet courtroom today? To find the practical, emotional center of this entire journey, we have to leave the apocalypse and return to the beginning. We must go back to the dust, the crowd, and the accused. The story ends exactly where it began. But everything has changed. Step back and look at the complete architecture of what God has built. We have traveled from the dusty city gates of ancient Israel to the stone pavement of the temple courtyard, outward to the fragile house churches of the Roman Empire, and finally into the cosmic trial of Revelation. It was a divine boundary line, designed to protect the vulnerable from isolated, malicious accusations. This is not ultimately a story about legal evidence or courtroom procedure. The law of 2 or 3 witnesses was never simply a mathematical formula for gathering evidence. As we established at the beginning, this is not ultimately a story about legal procedure. It is a story about the sacred weight of truth and the preservation of human life. It is an unfolding story of rescue. The law began as a brutal physical deterrent to stop malicious liars. It escalated into a brilliant legal snare that exposed hypocrisy. It transformed into a shield that protected the early church from being torn apart by gossip. And ultimately, it stands as a cosmic guarantee that the truth of God cannot be executed by a hostile world. But this vast, historical pattern must eventually become personal. Return to the opening image. Imagine the blinding afternoon sun, the dry dust of the courtyard, and the loose circle of people holding heavy, jagged stones. Only this time, you are the one standing in the center. We live in a culture of constant accusation. We have built a world of digital stones, where isolated voices can hurl lethal words from the shadows, destroying reputations in an instant without ever having to look their victims in the eye. We live with the anxiety of exposure, the fear of judgment, and the heavy weight of our own genuine failures. When you stumble, or when a relationship fractures, the world is always ready to form a circle. It is a story about the sacred weight of truth and the preservation of human life. It is the story of how Jesus stepped into the courtroom and demanded an execution. But what does Jesus do? He steps into your courtyard, Jesus is the ultimate, true witness. 2,000 years ago, he did not just silence a crowd in Jerusalem. He allowed himself to be dragged into the center of the ring. At his own trial, the religious leaders brought forward false witnesses against him. They coordinated their lies. They committed perjury. And Jesus, the only truly innocent man in human history, allowed the snare to close. He absorbed the execution so that the stones of judgment would never have to fall on you. Because he took the penalty, he has fundamentally changed the courtroom. When you read Matthew 18 today, you do not have to read it with terror. When Jesus says, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them," he is making a breathtaking promise. He is saying that when your community gathers to handle failure, sin, or conflict, they are no longer gathering to condemn you. The stones have been dropped. The 2 or 3 are gathering to pull you out of the dust, and the supreme judge of the universe is standing in the center of the room, not to demand your life, but to give you his own. This is the final verdict of the biblical courtroom. The law that once demanded death has become the very place where you are restored of accusation and transformed a mandate of death into an engine of grace. But to understand what Jesus built, we first have to understand you do not have to live in the shadows of accusation anymore. The stones are gone. What he was fighting against. To understand the profound mercy of his promise, we have to return to the terror of the ancient world. Step back from the modern courtroom for a moment. In our world, justice relies heavily on the silent testimony of physical objects. When a crime is committed, investigators look for fingerprints left on a window pane. They extract DNA from a discarded coffee cup. They pull GPS data from a smartphone and retrieve security footage from a camera across the street. We expect the physical environment to tell us the truth, even if the suspect lies. The ancient world had none of this. Imagine standing trial in an ancient Israelite village. The court did not convene in a quiet, climate-controlled room under the law of Moses. A man cannot be put to death by the sudden rage of a mob. It gathered at the city gate, where dust clung to the sandals of the local elders and the noise of the marketplace pressed in on every side. There were no blood tests, no ballistics, and no paper trails. Truth was established entirely by human memory and human speech. In this environment, a person's word was not merely an opinion, it was a loaded weapon. If a powerful rival coveted your family inheritance, he did not need to forge a complex legal document to take it. He only needed to stand before the elders and declare that he saw you curse God, or that he witnessed you commit a crime in the fields. This vulnerability is exactly how Queen Jezebel would later murder an innocent farmer named Naboth. She hired 2 corrupt men to publicly bring a false charge against him, legally satisfying the requirement to have him stoned and his property seized. Without physical science to prove an alibi, a defendant's life hung entirely on the credibility of the voices speaking against him. Because of this terrifying vulnerability, the law of Moses instituted an uncompromising firewall. Deuteronomy 19 declares, "A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed." One voice is never enough to secure a conviction. He cannot be executed simply because a single prominent citizen points a finger. According to the strict commands of Deuteronomy, by demanding 2 or 3 witnesses, biblical law intentionally slowed down the machinery of judgment. It made revenge difficult. A single angry man could no longer execute his rival in a sudden fit of rage or jealousy. To destroy a life, he would have to find someone else willing to join his lie. He would have to coordinate his story, align his timeline, and convince another human being to participate in a lethal deception. The requirement of multiple witnesses was not just a mathematical formula for gathering data, it was a psychological barrier, designed to protect the vulnerable from isolated malice. It broke the power of the solitary accuser. But the law recognized a darker reality. Sometimes, men do conspire. Sometimes, 2 people are perfectly willing to coordinate a lie if the reward is high enough or the hatred is deep enough. If 2 men agree to stand at the city gate and swear under oath that they saw a crime, the mathematical requirement is met. The innocent person is still condemned. If words alone can kill, and if two people can easily coordinate those words, how does a society prevent mass injustice? God's solution was brilliant, and it was severe. He did not merely command the witnesses to be honest. The judges must wait for two specific men to step forward from the shadows. Until 2 or 3 witnesses stand together in the center of the ring, he did not simply warn them about a future spiritual judgment. Instead, he engineered a physical mechanism directly into the execution process. He forced the accusers to feel the literal, crushing weight of their own words. Return to the courtyard from the opening scene. The man is still bound in the dust. The crowd is still waiting. Why are they waiting? Because in the ancient Israelite justice system, the executioner is not a faceless state official wearing a hood. The government does not handle executions quietly in a hidden room. The community handles it. And the violent process must be initiated by the accusers themselves. Deuteronomy 17 adds a terrifying physical requirement to the mathematical rule of 2 or 3 witnesses. Verse 7 gives this uncompromising command regarding the guilty person. The hand of the witnesses shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. Consider the physical and psychological reality of this command. You have just stood before the elders at the city gate. You have sworn an oath. You have spoken your testimony, claiming this man committed a capital offense. You have convinced the judges, but your job is not finished. The court does not dismiss you to go home to your family while the sentence is carried out. Instead, the elders hand you a heavy, jagged stone, look the accused in the eye, and speak the exact same testimony. The stones must remain in the hands of the crowd. You cannot hide in the back of the crowd. You cannot anonymously hurl an accusation from the safety of distance. You must step into the center of the ring. You must look the accused in the eyes. You must raise your own arm, feel the rough weight of the rock against your skin, and throw the first lethal strike. Only after the witnesses have initiated the violence is the rest of the community permitted to join in and finish the execution. This is the raw, brilliant deterrent of biblical justice. You cannot accuse someone from the shadows. You cannot casually destroy a reputation and let the legal system do the dirty work. If you want a man to die, you must take his life with your own hands. The law intentionally forces the witness to feel the physical consequence of their spoken words. It transforms an abstract verbal testimony into a deeply personal, visceral act. This requirement acted as a brutal psychological filter. It is one thing to whisper a lie in the marketplace out of petty spite. It is an entirely different matter to shatter a man's bones while his neighbors watch. How many angry men, eager to settle land disputes with false testimony, suddenly found their throats dry when they realized they would have to draw the first blood? Deuteronomy 17 is absolute. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. The requirement of the first stone ensured that words were never cheap. But human corruption is incredibly dark. What happens if the hatred is strong enough? What happens if 2 men coordinate a lie and are perfectly willing to cast those first stones? If a pair of conspirators is corrupt enough to commit perjury, they might be ruthless enough to commit murder. The physical deterrent of the stone is not always enough to stop a determined, malicious liar. The law of Moses anticipated this exact scenario. And so, the requirement of 2 or 3 witnesses contained a second, hidden mechanism. It was a built-in trap, specifically designed to catch the false accuser before the stone was ever thrown. The physical deterrent of the executioner's stone was powerful, but it was not enough. To stop the most hardened liars, the law had to turn their own weapon against them. To understand how this worked, we need to look at the exact language God used to describe a liar. In the Hebrew text, the phrase for false witness is ed sheker. At its most basic level, it means a witness of falsehood. The English translation is accurate, but the original term carries an active, aggressive nuance that we often miss. In modern English, a person shall not be put to death on the evidence of one witness. It is a severe, terrifying courtroom. A false witness could simply mean someone who misremembered a detail or made an honest mistake on the stand. But in the ancient world, shikir was not an accident. It was a calculated deception. It was a snare, deliberately set to destroy another person. The ed shikir was a predator using the legal system as a weapon of assassination. This is why the 9th commandment, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor," was not just a general rule about telling the truth in daily conversation. It was a specific command against weaponizing the court. And Proverbs repeatedly warns that the ed shikir will not escape punishment. But how did the ancient court actually punish them? This is where Deuteronomy 19 springs the trap. If an accusation was made, the judges were required to investigate the witnesses carefully. They cross-examined the two men. They looked for inconsistencies, and if the judges discovered that the testimony was shikir, a coordinated lie, the law issued a stunning verdict. Deuteronomy 19:19 commands, "Then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." This is the famous law of retaliation, but applied directly to the accuser. In this world, a spoken word carries lethal consequence. Now, fast forward roughly 1500 years, the punishment for perjury was not a standard fine. It mirrored the crime perfectly. If you lied in a trial about a stolen ox, you were forced to pay the penalty for the ox. But if you committed perjury in a capital trial, if you conspired to have an innocent man stoned to death, you were immediately sentenced to die. The exact punishment you engineered for the accused was dropped onto your own head. Imagine the sudden, freezing terror in the city gate. The judges press the witnesses on a detail. The timeline suddenly fractures. The two men contradict each other. In an instant, the trial flips. The accusers realize their snare has snapped shut on their own ankles. The heavy stones they were preparing to hurl at the defendant will now be used on them. By combining these three elements, the requirement of multiple witnesses, the physical act of throwing the first stone, and the lethal trap of perjury, God built a fortress around the vulnerable. For centuries, this severe law protected Israel from mass injustice. It was a flawless system when used justly. But centuries later, Jesus walks into a temple courtyard, and this beautiful, protective law is violently weaponized.